Welcome to the deep dive. You're likely here because you want to get a handle on the big, complex issues shaping our world, but, without getting bogged down for weeks.
Exactly. You want to get to the core of it quickly and thoroughly.
And today, that issue is, well, it's the evolving nature of nuclear risk.
Yeah.
It's a topic that can feel pretty heavy, maybe even a bit scary.
It definitely can. But we're going to try to navigate it together. We're taking a deep dive into what a lot of experts are now calling the new nuclear age.
Right. So our mission, if you will, is to pull out the key insights. What can recent events, recent analysis tell us about the threats of nuclear conflict today? How are they changing?
And to guide us, we're drawing heavily on the work of Ankit Panda. He's a senior fellow over at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, really a leading voice on nuclear security.
He wrote the book, The New Nuclear Age, At the Precipice of Armageddon, and recently did a really insightful interview with Vox.
Okay.
We've distilled the key takeaways from that conversation for you.
Okay, so where do we start? Panda breaks down the nuclear age into 3 distinct eras. It's a helpful way to frame it, I think.
Yeah, it is. The first era, that's basically 1945, right up to the end of the Cold War.
Right. Dominated completely by the U.S.-Soviet arms race, the constant looming threat of, massive nuclear war. That was the defining feature.
A two-player game, essentially, with incredibly high stakes.
Then came the second phase, after the Soviet Union collapse, maybe running up until, say, the mid-2020s.
And that period felt different, didn't it? There was real progress on arms control, a sense that maybe the biggest danger had passed.
There was, but new worries popped up. Nuclear terrorism became a bigger concern, and proliferation states like North Korea getting the bomb.
So a shift in the type of threat, maybe. Less existential, but still deeply concerning.
Precisely. And that brings us to where Panda argues we are now, the third nuclear age. Kicked off around the mid-2020s, and we're right in the middle of it taking shape.
Okay, so what makes this third era different?
It's really a convergence of factors. First, renewed tensions between the major powers, the U.S., Russia, and importantly, China, which is rapidly building up its nuclear forces.
And at the same time, the arms control structures that helped manage things, they're weakening.
They are. Key treaties are eroding. New START, the last big one between the U.S. and Russia, is set to expire next year. That's a huge deal.
Wow. And then there's the technology angle Panda brings up. Cyber, AI. How do they fit in?
Well, they're not nuclear weapons themselves, obviously. But they create new ways for things to go wrong, new pathways to instability, to miscalculation, especially in a crisis. Imagine cyber attacks hitting command and control systems, for instance.
That's unsettling. And he points to the war in Ukraine as kind of exhibit A for this new era, right?
Absolutely. He sees it as a stark illustration of the dynamics, a real wake-up call.
Okay, let's talk about deterrence. That's the bedrock idea, is it?
Yeah.
That mutually assured destruction keeps everyone from actually using these weapons.
It is. And look, it's largely credited with preventing nuclear war so far. It's a grim kind of logic, but it has played a role.
But Panda isn't entirely sold on it being foolproof. He calls himself a deterrence pessimist.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point. He acknowledges deterrence is real, it has effects, but he stresses it's not perfectly safe. Why? Because it relies on humans and organizations.
And humans make mistakes. Organizations can fail.
Exactly. He points back to the Cold War, all those close calls we now know about. False alarms on radar screens, communication breakdowns, near misses that could have spiraled out of control due to technical glitches or just bad luck.
Right, the human element. These aren't abstract theories. They're real systems run by fallible people under immense pressure.
So Panda's argument is you can't just rely on deterrence theory working perfectly on paper. It needs constant, active, careful management, especially now as things get more complex.
And speaking of complex, dangerous situations, that recent India-Pakistan standoff, that really seemed to crystallize some of these new risks.
It absolutely did. Panda described it as the first South Asian nuclear crisis of this third nuclear range. And maybe even more striking, he called it the most intense multi-domain engagement between 2 nuclear-armed countries ever.
Multi-domain, meaning not just troops on the ground, but cyber, maybe space assets too.
That seems to be the implication, yes. A conflict playing out across multiple dimensions simultaneously. And Panda suggests India, under Modi, might have been trying to call Pakistan's nuclear bluff.
Testing the limits, basically.
Yeah.
Pushing back harder against perceived state-backed terrorism to see how far Pakistan was willing to escalate.
That appears to be the interpretation, and it connects to this idea of nuclear blackmail. Panda offers a nuanced take here.
Go on.
Well, he suggests that what one side calls blackmail, threatening nuclear use to stop conventional attacks, might just be deterrence from the other side's perspective.
So it depends which side you're on.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He mentions Putin's nuclear signaling in Ukraine as another example.
Huh.
It's deterrence in action, even if it feels like blackmail to those being deterred.
This must have forced Pakistan to really rethink its assumptions, right? About how well its nukes actually deter India.
Almost certainly. And the U.S. role, or initial lack thereof, was also interesting.
Yeah, there seemed to be some hesitation in Washington at first. Some statements suggesting maybe it wasn't a top priority.
There was that impression. J.D. Vance made a notable statement along those lines. But then the U.S. stance seemed to shift pretty quickly towards active engagement.
And Panda thinks the trigger might have been intelligence about Pakistan potentially moving nuclear weapons.
That's his speculation, yes. And it makes sense. That kind of activity would set off major alarm bells globally.
It just underscores that preventing actual nuclear use, breaking that taboo, is still a core interest, isn't it? Even if the strategic focus shifts.
Absolutely. The taboo against use is fundamental. No one wants to see that line crossed, regardless of other geopolitical shifts.
Okay, but this uncertainty, maybe around U.S. commitments, seems to be feeding another worry. Proliferation. More countries getting interested in having their own nukes.
That's definitely a concern Panda highlights. You're seeing increased discussion, particularly in places like Europe and South Korea.
Countries that have traditionally relied on the U.S. nuclear umbrella.
Exactly. Now, this isn't totally new. West Germany, South Korea, they considered it during the Cold War too, before ultimately deciding against it, relying on the U.S. guarantee.
But Panda feels it's more serious now.
He seems to think so, yeah, because it's happening while the U.S. is, as he puts it, relitigating its entire grand strategy, rethinking its global role, its alliances.
Which naturally makes allies nervous.
Understandably. He talks about the load-bearing function of U.S. extended deterrence. It covers something like 50 countries. If that feels less reliable, some might think about going it alone.
But it's not inevitable, right? Getting nuclear weapons is incredibly hard and expensive.
Oh, absolutely not inevitable. Panda stresses that. Even if a country wants them for security, the practical hurdles are immense. The cost, the technology, the international backlash. It's a massive undertaking.
Let's circle back to Ukraine. Panda called it a wake-up call. How has it changed the nuclear picture?
Well, it's shifted the focus, hasn't it? Less about the Cold War nightmare of an all-out exchange between superpowers.
And more about the risk of nuclear use within a conventional war, especially one involving a nuclear power or its key interests.
Exactly that. Ukraine shows how deterrence is working in this new era in complex, sometimes contradictory ways.
How so?
Well, deterrence has arguably allowed Russia to wage its conventional war without direct NATO intervention. But it's also allowed NATO to arm Ukraine extensively without triggering a direct Russia-NATO conflict.
So it enables and constrains both sides.
Precisely. Both Russia and NATO seem to have respected certain red lines, even if there's immense frustration on both sides. But the potential for miscalculation is always there.
Okay, looking ahead. What about policy under a potential second Trump administration? That's a big question mark for many.
It is. Right now, Panda notes, there isn't a huge push on arms control from the Trump camp. Policy seems to be largely following the current Biden administration's path for now.
But Trump himself, his past statements on nuclear weapons are kind of all over the place, aren't they?
They are a bit, yes. He has acknowledged the danger, sometimes very starkly, said it's maybe a bigger threat than climate change, and he's occasionally shown interest in arms control, even called it a dream back in the 80s.
So could he pursue it in a second term? Maybe for legacy reasons.
Panda suggests that's possible. A legacy motivation could be powerful. But the negotiating landscape is very different now. Russia would come to the table with a different mindset.
And didn't the first Trump administration try arms control talks with Russia and China that didn't really go anywhere?
They did, and a key reason they failed was that neither Russia nor China felt it was really in their national interest at the time. So even if talks happen, any resulting agreements might not look like what the U.S. or its allies would ideally want.
Then there's the New START treaty expiring next year. That feels like a really concrete deadline.
It's a major milestone. Panda doesn't expect to return to massive Cold War arsenal sizes. It's just too expensive. But the treaty's expiration formally ushers in this less constrained, multipolar nuclear era, no more limits.
And China's buildup is a huge factor here. Panda mentioned projections of maybe 1,500 warheads by the mid-2030s.
It's the estimate, yeah. A massive increase from where they were. And that fundamentally changes the strategic equation for the U.S.
So the big question for the U.S. becomes, do we need more nuclear tools to handle Russia, China, and North Korea all at once?
That's the debate. Realistic options might not mean building thousands of new missiles, but maybe putting more warheads on existing systems, for example.
But the risk there.
Is that Russia and China see that as provocative, and they react, and you potentially trigger a new arms race.
Exactly.
It's a dangerous spiral.
Finally, Panda touches on public awareness. It feels like, despite everything, nuclear weapons aren't debated as intensely as during the Cold War.
It's true, isn't it? Even with a movie like Oppenheimer getting attention, it doesn't seem to have the same constant background hum of anxiety for younger generations in the West.
Generational experience matters, I guess, if you didn't grow up with duck and cover drills.
Right. Panda contrasts that with his own experience growing up in India during nuclear tests and regional tensions. It was much more present.
And his point is that younger people really need to understand this isn't a solved problem, that it's still a major source of potential catastrophe.
Exactly. Because ultimately, responsible national leaders and an informed public are crucial, especially in the U.S., where the president has that unique sole authority over nuclear use.
That power is just immense.
It really is, which makes public understanding and engagement so vital.
So wrapping this up, our deep dive into Panda's analysis really paints a picture of a shift, doesn't it? Into this new nuclear age, more complex, multipolar, with arms control fraying, new technologies adding risk, and regional conflicts having potentially global nuclear implications.
Yeah, it's a sobering picture, but hopefully, for you listening, this has given you a clear framework, a way to understand the key features of this current nuclear landscape, which was our goal: quick, thorough understanding.
And it leaves us with a final thought, building on Panda's point about citizens. Given that immense power held by leaders, especially the U.S. president, what responsibility do informed citizens like you actually have? How can you shape the conversation and push for responsible policies in this new and arguably more dangerous nuclear age?
That's definitely something worth thinking about long after this deep dive ends.
Thanks for joining us to explore this critical topic.